Hello and welcome to everyone joining us today from around the world. Thank you for arriving here to listen to Michigan State University's signature lecture. More than 500 people have registered for this event, and we are also currently streaming live on Facebook and on YouTube. Our esteemed guest tonight, of course, is MacArthur Genius, Guggenheim Fellow, and Frederick Iseman Professor at Yale University, Claudia Rankine. My name is Divya Victor, and I am an associate professor at Michigan State University's Department of English. I welcome you to make yourselves comfortable while also listening to the discomforts and questions that arise within you as you listen actively to Claudia Rankine's lecture. Feel free to take notes and write down questions as you listen. We're so pleased to have you here with us. We will initiate today's event with a few words from representatives of collaborating units at Michigan State, followed by an introduction to Claudia by Kelsey Walker, a recent graduate of MSU. After the lecture, we will begin fielding questions from the audience. Our panelists today are my wonderful colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Katie Grilick and Georgia Erger from the Broad Museum, Dr. Joshua Maybe from the Department of English. Please use the Q&A button on the webinar to submit questions to the speaker during the event. Due to the volume of questions and the size of the audience, we seek your understanding if we're not able to address all questions today. As one of the coordinators of this event, it would be customary for me to deliver Michigan State University's land acknowledgement. This would state that the university is built on ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. Many people believe that a land acknowledgement is one way to alert an audience to the ongoing and systemic erasure of the cultures, practices, and languages of Indigenous peoples and the native Anishinaabe perspectives. However, such a statement does not acknowledge the embodied act of speaking an acknowledgement, nor does it acknowledge the impact of such a statement on an audience which includes the very people of whose painful, traumatic histories we speak. This is especially true if the land acknowledgement does not articulate contemporary realities and truths of the citizens of the many nations surviving under continued settler colonialism in a country built by enslaved and indentured labor and immigrants, including naturalized immigrants like me. As we gather into this space to consider the fraught notion of citizenship and the urgent need for racial justice, I invite us to consider the unnamed erasures and undocumented injustices done unto native peoples of this land, and to contemplate our complicity with these. I invite us to consider how we came to be on this land, who we are when we are here, and how our presence can obscure or dislodge someone else's presence. As a poet and a teacher, I refuse the mere land acknowledgement as a restorative act with the guidance of Dr. Gordon Henry, Professor of English and Creative Writing, and the citizen of the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation. Listening does not take place in a room built of brick and mortar, but in the chambers of your hearts and in the hallways of your conscience. The power of the speaker comes not from the authority granted them by some grand institution, but in how they reach us and ask us to question ourselves. So I invite you to learn how your own location overlaps with other histories of place, of sovereignty, and to remain open to the questions that are arising within you as you listen to Claudia Rankine. Given the content of the talk today, please be aware that the event will contain a racial epithet. The organizers would like to thank the Dean's offices and the marketing and communications team at the College of Arts and Letters, the interns, the curators and programmers at the Broad Art Museum, the extraordinary librarians at MSU's libraries, our colleagues and staff at the Department of English, the Creative Writing Program, the Film Studies Program, the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures. I would also like to state my special appreciation for Dr. Katie Grulich of the Broad Museum and Penny Shanks, the college's tireless event coordinator, for their genial and indispensable roles in putting this event together with me during a global pandemic. I will now turn it over to Dr. Christopher Long, Professor of Philosophy and the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters. Welcome, Dean Long.
Thank you, Divya. It's a pleasure to be here, and good evening, everyone. Let me begin by thanking our students, faculty, friends, and alumni for joining us for the 2020 Signature Lecture Series presented by the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University. Support for this series comes from our generous sponsors, including the Community Engagement Fund for the College of Arts and Letters and the Frank A. Teggy Endowment Fund. For more than 28 years, their generosity has enabled our faculty, students, and the wider community within and beyond Michigan State University to engage and interact with the leading artists and scholars of our time. Tonight, in the wake of a searing election, in the midst of a pandemic, as we undertake with action-oriented intention an urgent reckoning with the long legacy of racism in America, we are honored to have Claudia Rankine join us. Claudia Rankine is the Frederick Iseman Professor of Poetry at Yale University and author of 6 collections of poetry, 3 plays, and many powerful essays. She wrote the 2014 New York Times Bestseller hybrid prose poetry book, Citizen, An American Lyric, which has been widely recognized for bringing national attention to police violence against Black Americans, racial prejudice, historical trauma, implicit bias, and white supremacy. Her eloquent and insistent art requires us to confront the anti-Black racism at the heart of the American story. Claudia Rankine's presence with us tonight is a timely gift made possible by meaningful collaborations across campus. I would like to thank the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum, the Department of English, the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Culture, the MSU Libraries, and the Creative Writing and Film Studies program for bringing Claudia to us this evening. And in particular, I would like to thank Professor of English, Divya Victor, without whom none of this would be possible. Your unwavering attention, Divya, always to ensure that we infuse our interactions with one another with our deepest commitments to justice and care and love is what holds us together this evening. Thank you. And now, before we begin, I would like to introduce the director of the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum here at Michigan State University, Dr. Monica Ramirez Montaguet.
Thank you so much, Chris. My name is Monica Ramirez Montaguet, and I am the director of the Eli. I've been recently appointed the director of the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum. And today it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation with Claudia Rankine in the context of Claudia and John's exhibition titled Situations at the museum. Situations is the result of 14 years of artistic collaborations between Claudia and John. And it's also the first time that all of these videos come together under one single physical space. And it's an unprecedented opportunity for our communities to discover the dialogue between the videos themselves, and also through that discovery to be boldly inspired to dialogue about race and racism in our world today. So the engagement with the exhibition, Claudia, if I may share, has been in our campus, in our local region, really remarkable. The depth of the conversations that have been sparked by the exhibition has been very revealing. The conversations have been sincere and truthful, and at points a little bit overwhelming. However, this exhibition was so necessary for us, for our communities, and particularly at this moment. So thank you again so much for sharing with us situations. And thank you to my colleagues, Georgia Erger and Katie Gerlich, the curators, assistant curators at the Broad Art Museum, for diligently working to make this exhibition a reality. The exhibition situations and Claudia's presentation today sets the stage and a high bar for the museum, us, to continue doing the work of moving the institutional needle towards equity. This museum aims to critically amplify the stories by represented communities and individuals through the lens of art, and to create inclusive environments of meaningful civic engagement where we can actually learn from each other. So the Situations exhibition revealed for us several tools. Thank you, Claudia and John. It illuminated several pathways for us to be able to follow your steps. And for example, it gave us the example that a 14-year collaboration between you indicates that confronting racism is an ongoing, focused, dedicated, resilient journey that will require from us, the museum, to continue to respond, to be creative, to be brave, candid, bold, to come together and to continue coming together as we learn together and from one another. So I think the exhibition situations, for all of us that were able to enjoy it and to see it, there's no way back from situations. There's no way to hide what has been revealed to you. There's no way to unfeel what you've been feeling, and there's no way to unlearn what you just learned. And in the same way, today, this forum that brings us together, we are all being witnesses of a space where we are building, where we are creating a space that's going to help us together move the needle towards equity. And in the style of Claudia and John, if I may, it will be a space that through the reverent and irreverent tools of poetry, film, art, introspection, humility, and compassion, we will come together to learn from one another. So Claudia, in the spirit of we the people, we the 360 people that are here in this lecture, we thank you and welcome everyone. We look forward to the discussion. And so I'm going to pass the microphone back to my colleague, Divya. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I will soon turn it over to Kelsey Walker, poet and playwright. We are proud to call Kelsey an MSU graduate. She graduated with a degree in English just last semester and was also one of the winners of the Who is a Citizen Prize awarded to film and literature responding to this very question, inspired by Claudia Rankine's book, Citizen. Before I turn it over to Kelsey, a reminder. After Claudia's lecture, we will begin fielding questions from the audience, and we'll be very glad to present these to our speaker. Once again, just drop your questions using the Q&A button. Due to the size of this audience, we may not be able to get to everyone's questions. We appreciate your understanding. Over to you, Kelsey.
Thank you, Divya, and good evening. From the beginning of my formal education up until last year, I was exposed only to the work of canonized white writers who don't share my experience as a Black woman. These writers often had a penchant for reducing Black women to supporting and often defamatory roles, that is, if they wrote about Black women at all. Caught between a lack of representation and representation that took a hammer to my self-image, I grew up with the idea that there wasn't enough space for me to freely exist. This manifested in small but noticeable ways. For example, I would instinctively move out of someone's way despite not being in their way. Despite being told I was fine as I was, I always felt in the way. I always put the comfort of others ahead of my own, and I used to stay quiet about my experience and my culture for fear that I wasn't worth being heard. I had been excluded from spaces so often that I began excluding myself. I was first introduced to Claudia Rankine's work last year, my senior year at Michigan State. At that point in my education, I wasn't exposed to many Black women writers, Maya Angelou and Audre Lorde, of course, but very few others. Reading Claudia Rankine's work, I felt that there was space for me to exist in as I was. I felt that I was given permission to make space for myself, both physically and otherwise. I was given permission to protect that space. Rankine's work unapologetically captures the many experiences of Blackness in America. She calls attention to the everyday facets of discrimination and its weight on our bodies, our minds, and our histories. She documents the myth that only Black people are responsible for managing racial bias. She understands the daily difficulty of refusing such responsibility when it feels necessary for success and survival. She poses difficult questions to whiteness and to white people about their responsibility as allies. In her book, Citizen and Just Us, she invites a variety of viewpoints to help tell or hear the story, where both telling and hearing are actions that launch understanding. This year, after seeing more sincere discussions of what it means to be anti-racist and active attempts to put that into action from white people, I feel that we're moving towards a moment where more white people are paying attention to what's happening, to what's been happening, and helping us do something about it. Now that more of us are renewing our pledge to each other with a desire to give genuine assurance, how do we proceed? How do we honor that contract? What questions need to be asked and what actions need to be taken moving forward? And for people of color who may share experiences similar to mine, how do we learn to unapologetically hold space for ourselves the way that we deserve? I'm not saying that Rankine holds all the answers to these questions, nor am I trying to put that responsibility onto her. I am saying that today, we have a chance to engage with a brilliant mind who not only shares her story with us, but continues to document and explore the stories of many other brilliant minds. This is a great opportunity to listen and to ask questions of your own as you listen to Claudia Rankine deliver her lecture. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, Claudia Rankine earned a BA at Williams College and an MFA at Columbia University. Rankine has published several collections of poetry, including Citizen, an American lyric, a finalist for the National Book Award and winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry, the Penn Center USA Poetry Award, and the Ford Poetry Prize. Rankine has been awarded fellowships from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Academy of American Poets, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Linden Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation. In 2013, she was elected Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. Please welcome Claudia Rankine as she delivers this year's signature lecture.
Hi, Kelsey, thank you. I want to say congratulations, Michigan, for helping us be a democratic country. You have my undying gratitude. I am so pleased to be here. I feel like I've been in a long relationship with the Broad Museum, and I love that this lecture is a collaboration between the university, pedagogy, writing, and art, because that is how I would describe my work. And so it's symbiotic and also relevant to this talk. I'm going to talk about Just Us, the new book, which is a book about conversation, and kind of walk us through the book in terms of its images. In order to do that, I'm going to share my screen. And there we have it. That is the title, and we'll go to the first image, which is the cover. This is the cover of Just Us. You'll recognize it as the reflecting pool. It's a photograph by the photographer Nona Fastine. She made an error in the printing process where that black cloud going across the middle obstructed the view. And at first she thought it meant that the photo wasn't good. But then in thinking about how justice works in this country, she thought, oh, you can't get to these monuments unless you move through the afterlife of slavery, to use Saidiya Hartman's term. And so she then kept that blackness as she photographed monuments around the country, and especially national monuments. I wanted this as the cover as opposed to some of the other ones because of that reflecting pool, that notion that we are looking back at ourselves in a move to both see who we are and who we can become. And I was thinking a lot about this quote by Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Mass. And I'm going to just read it here because I think it's the best way to begin this. He says, "As soon as I desire, I am asking to be considered. I am not merely here and now, sealed into thingness. I am for somewhere else and for something else. I demand that notice be taken of my negating activity insofar as I pursue something other than life, insofar as I do battle for the creation of a human world. That is a world of reciprocal recognitions." So that idea of reciprocal recognitions, what we get when we see another in front of us, not the replication of the self, but the replication of a human being in the other, and the ways in which the forces of justice have obstructed that notion of reciprocal recognitions is sort of at the heart of this book. And how do we get back to that? How do we get back to living and breathing reciprocal recognitions? This is another of Nona Fasteen's works at the Lincoln Memorial. And she did two versions, one with the people, one without the people. And here is the Statue of Liberty. The book has an epigraph, and that epigraph is by Richard Pryor, and it has the use of the N-word, so I'm a little apprehensive about playing it, but it is his part of his act, and so I will go ahead.
I went to jail for income tax evasion, right? You know, I didn't know a motherfucking thing about no taxes. I told the judge, I said, Your Honor, I forgot. You know, he said, you remember next year, nigga. Start writing on your ass. They give niggas time like it's lunch down there. You go down there looking for justice. That's what you find, just us. I went to jail.
Oops. So that's where the epigraph comes from. And the reason I was attracted to that joke as the title, I actually had the title first and then found the epigraph. But this, when Richard Pryor says it, the implication is that just us means Black people. You go down there looking for justice and you find just us. But what I also liked about it was the way it made justice and whiteness synonymous. So another way of hearing that joke is that the places where one can find justice is only for white people themselves. It's just for them. So the justice then moves into the category of whiteness. But crucial to me was that the movability, the slipperiness of who gets to be inside the word justice. Is it me, or is it someone who is not me? So that's how the book starts for us, for all of us in whatever dimension we find ourselves in. The book is about conversations, but before we can get to the conversation, we have to really look at what is preventing the conversation from happening. And much of Just Us talks about, not explicitly, but implicitly, how segregationist politics in this country coming out of white supremacist orientation has led us to a place where we can no longer even speak to each other. Many white people can go their entire lives actually without having meaningful conversations with people of color. And that leads to a situation where even the technology centralizes white people. And And so the first image in this book is a Shirley card. And I'm going to play a little bit of this for you. Let's see. John, oh. I might not be playing it.
Oh, no, I think, whoops, we have to go back. Sorry. I don't think it's.
Okay. So the Shirley card, the reason I wanted to show it to you is that the color balance was, for Kodak, was modulated only with white skin, so that when you use the camera to take film, to film Black people, the features were lost because it wasn't calculated into the way in which the camera technically worked. So the Shirley cards only had white women on them because, in fact, that's who white people were, who they were meant to portray. What caused them to change that was when people had natural wood floors, and they wanted to be able to distinguish between the different grains of the wood, and also the chocolate industry. They wanted to be able to distinguish between dark chocolate and light chocolate. And it was only then when those industries pushed to have the color balance fix to be able to tell the difference between shades of brown, that those Kodak films began to be able to actually show Black people on them. And you might have seen images where the Black people just sort of blur out. So that's where we start. And we start here because I wanted the book to begin in a place that gave us not just the historical reasons why whiteness is centralized, but also how it plays itself into our ordinary lives. If you could look at a chart that looked at immigration laws in this country, 1790 Immigration Act said that only white Anglo-Saxon men could own property and vote. And voting was dependent on owning property. And, you know, ever since then, people have worked very hard to get inside that equation. Women, people of color, Asian people, you know, very slowly over the centuries, that has opened itself up. The other dynamic in Just Us that I wanted to point out to you is that the book is full of erasures. And because I wanted to come up with a structure that replicated the dynamic of whiteness when it comes to other people, specifically anti-Blackness, and how it becomes a constant repetition of the erasure of others. And so Jasper John has referred to erasure as an additive subtraction. And I love that definition because it says that by taking things away, you get to see other things. You get to really focus in and show another meaning, revealing what was there all along. So these pages are from Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. And the Notes on Virginia, he talks about Black people in those notes, and slaves, and enslaved peoples. And so I took away the language so that you could actually really focus in on some of the things that he says. For instance, here he says, they seem to require less sleep, they being Black people. They are at least as brave. Their griefs are transient. And that idea of their griefs being transient has made its way forward into the 21st century, where patients are often told, you know, doctors have the belief that Black people don't feel pain in the same way that white people do. So many of these things have become part of the standard racial imaginary that white people bring to Black people in terms of their beliefs and the kinds of things they do are justified by these racist ideas that were put in place. The book also has erasures by other artists. This one, All Lives Matter, or the V is removed. It's by Hank Willis Thomas. And the V is removed here to bring out All Lives Matter. It's especially relevant considering our sitting president. And then there's one last example. This example is from one of the essays in Just Us. It's an essay about going to the theater. And I wanted to read the opening poem because it uses the language from this essay as a response to the essay. The opening poem is, "What does it mean to want an age-old call for change not to change, and yet also to feel bullied by the call to change? How is a call to change named shame, named penance, named chastisement? How does one say, what if, without reproach? The root of chastise is to make pure, the impossibility of that. Is that what repels and not the call for change? What if what I want from you is new, newly made, a new sentence in response to all my questions, a swerve in our relation and the words that carry us, the care that carries? I am here without the shrug, attempting to understand how what I want and what I want from you run parallel, justice and the openings for just us. So that's the opening poem, but the way I was able to write that poem, it was in response to an event that happened. I was invited to see a play called Fairview by Jackie Sibley's Jury, and I'm going to read you some of that so that you can see how it is that the book is structured. I'm going to read and then I'll explain to you how that poem, this play, and this erasure all are intertwined. I go to see Fairview, a play by Jackie Sibley's Jury, with a white female friend. She's interested in thinking about whiteness. This play is interested in thinking about race. We are covered in all directions. Near the end of the play, the fourth wall is broken. A character asks the white members of the audience to get up from their seats and walk on the stage, which has been transformed into a beige living and dining room with a staircase leading to the second floor. Faces will be revealed, composure tested. Effort must be made to stay within the request of the play. The Black actor wishes the space of the audience to hold Black people in a way the world does not. The request is presented as a conditional, what if? What if the audience in this space of the imagination can enact something that doesn't exist in our world? Is the stage now a segregated place as the Black actors join the Blacks in the audience? Has center stage transformed into the front of the bus, or is it now a whites-only boardroom? In the moment, no one knows what really is being proclaimed. A white man in the seat behind me says, "This is fucked up." Nonetheless, he makes his way to the stage. The white woman I am with remains in her seat. I am getting tense. The playwright is a Black woman, and I am a Black woman, and I want her play to have what it has requested, what I assume it needs. Is my identification with the playwright because she's Black, or because she's a woman, or because she's an artist? It's impossible to dissect. My tension begins to couple with a building resentment against my white friend. I feel betrayed by her. I am not the playwright. The playwright might think it's okay, think the success of the play depends on some white people staying in their seats. The playwright might be waiting for a Black person to get on stage with the white people. The playwright might have calculated the percentage of the audience, white members of the audience, who would not comply. Are my unbearable feelings a sign that I, a Black member of the audience, remain inside the play? The playwright might think, why are they listening to me, as more and more white audience members fill up the stage and people of color stay seated? Will the stage hold all the white people? Or, and this is what is troubling me, the playwright might have said exactly what she wants to happen. I am trying to listen to the actor speak the closing lines of the play, which it turns out are composed of quotes from famous Black writers. But all I can think about is my white friend's non-compliant presence in her seat. Why won't she do what she was asked? I can't understand why she can't do such a simple thing. Why can't she see it matters? Does it matter? In the sense that race matters, her refusal feels like an insistence on full ownership of the entire theater. Oh God, I'm beginning to feel pushed out of my own seat for the last minutes of the play, burdened by my association with her refusal. Taxi, I want to run. Away from what? An embodied refusal I can't help but see, and one that surprises me. My own mounting emotion in the face of what I perceive as belligerence, a friendship error despite my understanding of how whiteness functions. I thought we shared the same worldview, if not the same privileges. Be still, my beating, breaking heart. When the play finally ends, I say to my confounding friend, I didn't know you were Black. She doesn't respond. Given the irritation in my voice, it's not a comment seeking a response. It's my performance of my own refusal to engage beyond the terms of the play. Her performance of resistance felt like no solidarity insofar as I, as a Black person, dropped away at the request of the play, dropped away. She must understand the play's request is made in response to a world where Black people's requests don't matter. Why doesn't she recognize the moment as an offering of Black feminism? Though my friend and I are in the habit of checking in every few days over the next couple of weeks, we speak of everything but this day. Still, I can't stop returning to the image of her glued to her seat. She was 5 rows from the stage. Why does the memory continue to infuriate me and perplex me? Why am I not able to read this moment? Why am I not able to stop reading this moment? Why am I unable to settle it down and file it away? I asked my friend, this white woman who speaks of understanding and empathizing with so much, why didn't she go onto the stage? She looks at me. Is there a pause? Time seems to gather the space of the differences between us. She says, I didn't want to. I'm still looking at her. What does she see in my face? You didn't want to. Is she speaking about exhaustion? Exhaustion I can understand. Exhaustion is tied to fatigue and addressing the onslaught of an eternally rejuvenating racism brings forward fatigue in all of us. Or is it this simple? I don't have to do what a Black woman tells me to do. I'm white. Can't you see that? I didn't want to. And what I want is what matters. At the end, in the end, I am a white woman. I am the one who matters. I didn't want to. Are these the unspoken sentences that I am to defer to. So that's part of the essay that I wrote about our interaction. And my friend wrote a response, because with these essays, because they come out of conversations, and they began conversations between me and my friends that are still going on in some cases. I asked the people I had the conversation with to write responses, and not everyone did, but sometimes people did. And then I said, if you write the response, I will print the response exactly as you give it to me. And so this was her response. So of course, post talking to you and aided by the gym's treadmill, my brain started popping more thoughts, part of why I do love talking to you. Only now getting a chance to put thoughts down, maybe of interest to you and important to me. I know I shrink, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, from scenes where I'm asked personally or generally to feel bad as a white person, where whatever else is being asked, I'm also being asked to feel shame, guilt, to do penance, to stand corrected, to sit down, chastise. Obviously, some of this shrinking is just because who wouldn't? No one enjoys being chastised. Or do they? This is where my relation becomes important to me. My reaction becomes important to me. I react with a kind of nausea when I smell, as Darrell Pickney put it, white audiences who confuse having been chastised with learning. Of course, these are reasons to feel shame, guilt. There are reasons to feel shame, guilt, to be corrected, etc. That is, there is real history, and there are real situations and experiences and exchanges. I call for them. And some of my reaction is per who wouldn't, straight up defensive. But situations, claims, blog posts, diversity workshop activities, whatever, manufactured specifically to elicit white shame, penance, make me uneasy. I feel like unholy transactions are in the offing, like white moral masochism is getting a thrill. And her reaction surprised me, this idea that going to see an art piece that makes a request to imagine something that often doesn't exist in the real world, to actually just give up your seat for 5 minutes, all of a sudden turned into diversity work and chastisement, was surprising to me. And so what I did was I went back to the original essay that I read a portion of for you and redacted out all of my thinking so that we are now back to the actual skeleton facts. A white woman remains in her seat. Because it, all of the space of my conjecture came down to her feeling like she was being chastised, which was not something that I felt that she would have been feeling. I was more in a sort of exploratory mode. So that I wanted the erasures to show how the impossibility of a kind of equity, even in this imaginative space, became such a difficult thing for this particular white woman. The other parts of the book take images from actual events, looks at the treatment of children as criminals. This is famously the case where the policeman literally threw this Black teenager across the room in her chair. This is one where at a party, these girls were thrown down by the police. You can see So that is, these are children and those white policemen. And, you know, this happened 2 years ago. Another one in is this, this story was particularly interesting to me because in Albany, 4 12-year-old girls were strip searched for drugs in their middle school because they were laughing. They were hyper and giddy. It claimed serious concerns. So they made the children take off their clothes to make sure they didn't have drugs. And these were literally 12-year-old girls who have not been around laughing 12-year-old girls, but because they were Black, the laughter and the joy was equal to criminality. This image is also in Just Us, and it's there because of the space around the Washington, the Capitol. I have often associated the space as a space of protest. And in 1925, this was the first rally that occurred. And so this idea that white supremacy is not foundational to this country is in the face of the actual documents that are there. You know, we think of the Women's March on Washington, we think of the Civil Rights March on Washington, but that the first image is often not there. These are photographs by Mark Peterson. I'm going to end there because I know we have to move to questions, but these, I just wanted to show you the reason Mark Peterson's work is in the book is because these images were taken in the last 3 years at Klan rallies all over the country. So that sense that these are all in 2019, these are all the white supremacist hate groups tracked throughout this country. Many of them here in the part of the country that I'm in, on the East Coast, up here in Oregon, Washington, California, and then Texas, and then a few in the Midwest. But we tend to think of them as being only located in the South. I won't play this video. And the last thing I'll talk about is these Confederate, this image of this woman. She said something that I found really interesting. She said, in the removal of Confederate monuments, the people who object to that should see Black people as the testament of the Confederacy. That came out of enslaved people, and as long as we are walking around, we are the reminder of that. So let me stop there, and so we can move to questions. I will stop sharing my screen there. I did it. The last thing I will say is that the book is at its very center an act of conversation, and so it is really about the management of our own feelings in the desire to converse as a kind of reparative endeavor. And so that was the sort of drive behind writing Just Us.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Of course, your talk is very provocative and immersive, and of course, very, very timely. And I've been reading Just Us for the last 3 weeks. It's been on my bedside. And as you say, it's a book that is emerging out of a desire to connect and understand. And I think my first question would be regarding that desire. So I kind of have two nestled questions, bringing a couple of questions in from the audience into mine as well. Just Us, for those in the audience who haven't read it, is a book that uses quotidian, everyday experience as a kind of research. So the narratives documented in the book focus on, Claudia, your interactions in airports, in theaters, in phone calls to friends. And I was wondering, in trying to pay attention to the experiences you're having with strangers on one hand, and then family members and really close friends on the other hand, while also balancing, right, what we might think of as more removed forms of research, reading books, going to archives, and so on. Could you speak to the kind of attention or perhaps attentions you had to maintain and juggle in the kind of research you had to do for this book, especially in terms of maintaining the boundary between life and work? I think we have several writers here in our audience who are working in critical, autobiographical, poetic modes who are struggling with this question. How do you maintain the boundaries between life on one hand and sort of treating it as research, and then other forms of research on the other hand for your work?
Well, when I began to work on Just Us, it was sort of accidental. My students, I was teaching a class on constructions of whiteness, and for the final project, many of my students would interview family members or people in their dorms, their friends, and I thought, well, why don't I do that? Why don't I interview some people? And I thought, white men, besides my husband, white men are not people who I don't have a lot of white men in my life who are close friends. I have a couple, but not many. And like if I go to a party, it's hard they're not the first people who will come over or that I will go to. And so I thought, why not speak to white men, find out what they think about white male privilege. And the place, because pre-COVID and pre-quarantine, I was traveling so much, I would spend a lot of dead time on airplanes and in waiting areas. And often other business travelers were white men. You would go into business class or first class, and 98% of the people in there were white men. So I just thought, I'd start talking to them about their understanding of white privilege, not because I really don't know. I know how it functions in the world, but I don't know how they're thinking about it. And I did learn stuff from having these conversations. So that essay was written for the New York Times. And because of that essay had to be fact-checked. And so that fact-checking became part of the methodology of these essays. I started I hired a psychiatrist for this project. So when I had a conversation with somebody that I thought could be interesting in terms of thinking about race, I brought it into the psychiatrist, and I asked her, I said, let's think about why I say some of the things that I said, and let's think about why that whoever my interlocutor was said the things that they said. And also let's think about what kinds of fantasies I might be bringing to the situation. And that was the first round for the essays. The second round was I hired a professional fact checker. And in that round, he and I sat, and if I said, the kinds of things you might say at a dinner party, white men control the government. And then the question is, what are the facts that back up that statement? And so then we brought in all of the sort of factual evidence. Things like 31% of the population is made up, last time I checked, of white men, and they were holding something like 75% of elected offices. So then that would be the fact behind that casual statement. So the question after that was, how do you create a relationship between the facts and the statements? And sometimes the fact didn't support the statement, and I didn't want to pretend that the fact didn't support the statement. So I came up with an idea that on the verso page, we would have the facts, and on the recto side of the page, we would have the conversations. And then we put little red dots that would bring you to the extending facts if you want them. But then once that space was created over there, other things made their way in, images, other things that were related, tweets, so all of the available cultural material around that information. And then the last stage was to take the essay and send it back to the person who had had the conversation with. And then I would say to them, nobody ever said this is not the conversation we had, and this is not what I said. So mostly I got that right. What they did say was, this is what I said, but this is not what I meant. And as in the example that I read to you, they would then write what their feeling view of the situation was from their perspective.
Thank you. Yes, everything that you're saying really illuminates, how much of knowledge is constructed in that in the process of revision, ratification, cross-referencing, really dialogue, right? We don't think about these formal processes in everyday situations, but of course, everyday dialogue is full of these formal processes. And I think my colleague Georgia Egger has a question for you related to what you have said so far.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much. And I actually did want to just ask you a question about the fact check and specifically its layout in the book. So as you just described, and to everyone again, the prose is on the recto or right-hand side of the page, and then the fact check or the visual or literary sources are on the left-hand side of the page. And I really read that relationship between the prose and the fact checked as almost an analog form of hypertext. And I was just wondering if you could discuss your decision to make this additional textual and visual information immediately accessible to the readers in the way in which that does or doesn't function as really a necessary disruption within the prose.
Well, in a way, you could just turn everything you just said into a statement, and it would be the answer. But I was interested in how do you create an open text that actually led the reader into thought, to not just to take in the information on the page, but actually to be interested in what the intersection is between the statements and the facts and the charts and the tweets and in a time when we have fake news and no science and all kinds of strangeness determining our culture, coming out of a culture of whiteness because it's being produced by a president who says, I'm a nationalist, use that word, I'm a white nationalist. I wanted a book that brought back a kind of measure that interrupted the free-flowing statements that we made, so that it had to push up against a kind of reality. So you say that, but then there's this reality. So what do we do in that space? And as a reader, I also love the idea that I couldn't control where the reader went once they went into the facts. Like, what did they associate next? Where did that bring them? And so hence the idea of both disruption and openness within the text.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I really was sort of thinking about my rhythm as a reader in that relationship. And as I was moving through the book, I was really interacting with the fact checks and the sources in sort of, again, different rhythms as I was working my way through. So it was a really interesting experience thinking about how you consume information in a digital space, but then in this case on the page. So thank you, Claudia. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Katie Grulick, who has another question.
Hi, Claudia.
Hi, Katie.
Thank you so much. Citizen and Just Us remind me of collaborations among visual artists, especially documentary photographers and writers who have collected images of American life and recontextualized those images with language. I'm thinking particularly of Richard Wright's 12 Million Black Voices, for example, which draws out race and racism among and in conversation with many Works Progress Administration photographs. I think this question is especially compelling to us now because so many of us have to navigate this difficulty of marrying image and word in the way that we communicate every day. Could you tell us about your approach to marrying image and word and the process of navigating the conversation that emerges between these two very active agencies?
Thanks for that question. I mean, I have certain rules that I try to follow in the relationship between image and text. And one of them is that the image should not illustrate the text, that it should be in conversation with the text in such a way that it creates another pathway for thought, thinking, and consideration. And that's probably the most important thing, that the images are doing their own thing over there and only tangentially pass the reference in the text. In the book, the only place where I feel a little bit like the images are illustrating something is in the blondness section, because the gathering of images of blondness was to show the proliferation of it. So I wanted it to actually people the text in a certain way as we go through it. But in the case, the Shirley cards or the image of the KKK march, those are archival pieces that bring in a kind of pedagogy to the text, which I used to shy away from that aspect of my world, but it is 1/3 of my world. I have spent a lot of time teaching. And so I feel like I use image and text in a way also to engage things to know as we engage conversing.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I, as somebody who teaches across genres and across disciplines and investigates across genres and disciplines, it's always interesting to hear about different ways that images and words work together on the page. And I'm especially struck too by the ways that that relationship can be really surprising in ways that I don't anticipate when I'm looking at something that I feel is illustrative. But actually isn't, and is actually showing me something completely different in the subtext or in something that's right there that I just haven't been trained to see. Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Josh Umebi, who's going to begin fielding a couple of questions. Thank you.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much as well. And yeah, I'm going to relay a question from one of the audience members. And this relates back to what you were saying about some of the research that you were doing that's coming out of conversations with both friends and also with strangers. And this is from Muriga Sethi. And she says, "Thank you, Claudia, for this incredibly urgent work. I'm very interested in your practice of writing about your friends and painful daily encounters and inviting them to respond in writing. It can be so impossible seeming to have these frank conversations in which one person feels, quote unquote, chastised. how do you manage to do it over and over again in so many friendships? And how do your friends do it as well?
Well, some of those friendships have failed. None of the ones in Just Us, but others, because it does take a kind of trust and a core recognition of the other person, which is why I wanted to start with the Fanon quote of reciprocal recognition. But Audre Lorde says, when we define ourselves, when I define myself, the place in which I am like you, the place in which I am not like you, I am not excluding you from the joining, I am broadening the joining. And that quote means a lot to me, because I think people go into conversations thinking that it's a competition of rightness, like who's right and who's wrong. And I feel like we should think of conversations more about understanding how it is we are different, and recognizing and making room for the other person in the act of doing that. And but also not losing the range of our emotional reactions to what is going on. So that is one of the reasons why in the book I wanted to document my moments of frustrations, my moment of inability to engage further, or questioning or not questioning, because I think all of those things happen in these kinds of conversations, but I don't necessarily think that they should stop the conversation. Some of these conversations stopped and then started again weeks later. Like we took all we could take, and then it was brought up again a week later. Like, what did you say that? What is that? And none of us melted. Nothing happened to us. In my friendships, we continue on, and I think we have a respect for each other, especially in my cross-racial alliances, but also with other Black women. And we are different people. We have different commitments in the world and different needs, and so those conversations also, as documented, end up going in different ways.
Thank you. And that so speaks to our moment of dysfunction in so many ways, of the necessity of those kinds of dialogues. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Divya, who has another question for you.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Claudia. Staying with this question of how we dialogue and the kinds of ways in which our historical identities and our contemporary identities come into the room, I want to send you a question from an audience member regarding your conversation with your white friend and your comments around the diversity workshop, and your feeling of performing white masochism. This audience member asks, would Claudia be willing to comment a bit more on what she thinks her white friend meant by that workshop as a genre of training in the context of the workplace or the university? Might Claudia share her thoughts about the potentials and limitations of that genre as a site for institutional change? So that's the question.
Well, this question of diversity workshops, which is also addressed in, I feel like I'm a walking, here it is. But since we are talking about the book, Robin DiAngelo is somebody I reference many times in this book. And, she has done a lot of diversity work. She anti-racist work, not diversity work, but anti-racist work in her career. And I think that I was surprised that my friend who has read White Fragility would have used a play and seen the play as a diversity workshop. I was like, that was a surprise to me. Because it was a creative endeavor, making a creative ask, what if? Can you imagine something? but the diversity workshop inside the institution, you know, functions very differently. It seems to me that the intent is to create a conversation between people who have not been in an arena to have certain conversations. I mean, we show up to work to do other things, but racism and bias and microaggressions and all of those things, and the way that institutional racism is at play, is a force that is inside the workplace at all times. So it seems to me that if you create a space where those discussions can be monitored and looked at and performed in a certain kind of way, that it creates tools to then take back into our day-to-day quotidian interactions with other people. And that's how I've always understood the diversity workshop. It says, y'all, racism, anti-Blackness, real thing, but we don't talk about it. And it's not something that's coming up over the cooler, but maybe we can have a space where we address this thing that's having real ramifications in our lives. And I don't know why white people feel like it's an act of chastisement when it's really another kind of pedagogy. It's another kind of learning inside an institution of pedagogy. And why are you willing to learn how to use the computer, but not how to interact with the people around you, given those things that are at play? The other thing about Robin and DiAngelo's books that I want to say is that what they do is not tell us, they don't change us deeply in our lives, but it gives us definitions for things we recognize. And that, I think, is a very useful endeavor as well. So people go in with a kind of resistance to these workshops, these anti-racist workshop. But I either you're being racist or you're involved in learning how to be anti-racist. Those are, really the two options.
Amen to that. Thank you so much, Claudia. I'll turn it over to Georgia for another question.
Thanks, Divya. I have what I think is a wonderful final question from our audience. Claudia, Taylor Kovac asks, who would you most want to read your book?
The person I would most want to read any of my work, Just Us, Citizen, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, anything, is the person who wants to read it. And that's it. It's not, the book is not focused towards any specific gender or race or any. I think if you read the book and the book offers something to you, then you are the ideal reader for the book. And who that would be, I can't pretend to know. In the same way that the books that have been meaningful to me are books that maybe did not have me in mind as a reader. And yet they have spoken profoundly to me. So there's no way for me to name a reader.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Claudia. I'm just going to pass it over to my wonderful colleague, Divya, who's just going to say a few closing words. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia.
Thanks, Georgia. I'm really appreciative of these very incisive, questions that are coming through from the audience members, and I wish we could address all of them. Claudia, we're going to wrap up the event now. I wonder if you have any closing remarks or things to say.
Closing remarks. Well, I think I would just like us to think about going forward, that you know, today I was listening to Jill Scott Heron, The Revolution, his thing on revolution. And there is a way in which recognizing another person, giving them separateness and autonomy while still be willing to, you know, still being willing to engage them, is something that seems simple, but takes time. It takes close reading of that person. It takes a kind of generosity and a trust in our human endeavor. And so I really hope that going forward, and we're in such a divisive situation in this country right now, that we begin to move away from some of the language that was given to us in terms of us and them, and a kind of apartheid thinking, and really be willing to move out into a space of possibility between us, and see the space between us as a space of possibility. That is how I'm going to try to move forward, and I hope others will be willing to fail at it in the same way that I have sometimes failed at it and sometimes succeeded.
Well, and your sometimes failures and your sometimes successes have been, you know, the witness of our times, and I'm so grateful for that. And just some incredibly wise words to keep in mind as we wrap up today from Claudia: generosity, engagement with strangers and others we don't know, listening, patience, the close reading of persons, to see them as spaces, to see engagement as spaces of possibility, and to trust in the human endeavor so that we can go beyond this kind of apartheid thinking. So thank you so much, Claudia, for being with us, for your generous presence, and for sharing your time with us. As we close this event, I would also like to thank the many people who have worked really overtime and through a global pandemic to make this event possible. And I especially thank all the caregivers and the teachers who have supported my colleagues' lives as they worked on this really incredible, joyful event for me. Thanks to all the supporting units across Michigan State University for seeing the urgency and significance of Claudia's voice. The organizers will be in touch with audience members after this event. We'll be in touch with resources on racial justice and the roles of art and literature as agents of social change. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you all for being here with us. We wish you peace, reflective contemplation, and safety. From Michigan State University, this is Divya Victor. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.